Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in United States history. This lecture concerns Chapter 28, The Unraveling, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. The title of this chapter, about unraveling, refers to the idea that in the era of primarily covering the 1970s, both the traditional stability of the 1950s was gone, and the idealism of the 1960s was lost. And what was left behind was a general feeling in society that things were not quite right, that there was something off, something wrong with the way the United States was during this period. This feeling that the idealism of the 60s was not going to come to pass, instead we were falling into trouble, can be seen in the Altamont Music Festival in 1969. This is a music festival held at a motor racetrack in California so that hundreds of thousands of people could attend it. It was a free music festival headlined by one of the biggest bands of the time, the Rolling Stones. It was envisioned as a West Coast version of Woodstock, which had taken place in New York State. It was billed as another opportunity to express the positivity, the love, and the togetherness of the 1960s. But it turned out to be just the opposite. The crowd was angry. The crowd instigated trouble. A biker gang called the Hells Angels had been hired to provide security for the stage. And when people in the audience tried to rush on the stage, they beat them back with sawed-off pull cues. One man in particular became belligerent, a member of the audience named Meredith Hunter. He pulled a gun on the Hells Angels. They knifed him and beat him and killed him. The whole festival degenerated into chaos. And this showed people that the beliefs of the hippies that you could just say love and peace and everything would be good would not actually work in the real world. And this served as a symbol for what was to come in the decade that followed. One of the biggest problems in the 1970s was the continued strain of Vietnam. We've talked before in this course about how the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong realized that they didn't really have to win the war. They didn't have to defeat the numerically and technologically superior United States military. Instead, they just had to make the war unpalatable for Americans. We had to get tired of having our sons die in Vietnam, and then we would leave and they could take over. Well, this led to effectively a stalemate in Vietnam as body counts piled up and the anti-war movement grew in the United States. A new aspect of war that took place during the time of Vietnam, which led directly to the United States eventually losing the war, was it was the first living room war. It was a war where media technology was sufficiently sophisticated and openness of society had developed sufficiently that you could have reporters follow the troops into the field of battle and not just show the good side of the war that the military might want you to see, but the negative sides of it too. So television viewers could come home at night and watch the evening news and see exactly what kind of things were going on in Vietnam. In that sense, it was the first living room war. Rather than some distant thing that you wouldn't really find out about what was going on until the veterans came home. Instead, you could see it the very days that it was happening. Now, as I said, this meant that the reporters that were there could report not just on the good things that were happening, but the bad too. An example of this came in 1965. When CBS News aired a segment about some American troops who had came to a village in South Vietnam where they believed that members of the Viet Cong were hiding out. And they, in an attempt to find the Viet Cong, had ended up burning parts of the village. This was shown on CBS News. Here you can see a picture of a Vietnamese man screaming and crying for help even as his home is burned. Well, coverage like this ended up leading to negative views in America about the efforts of American soldiers in Vietnam. We were seen in some ways as the bad guys. Now, it was always more complicated than that. Maybe this village really was a place where they were hiding out Viet Cong soldiers who were trying to kill Americans. Maybe they deserved to have their homes burned. We don't know. But we know that when it was shown on CBS News, the Vietnamese natives appeared to be the victims of an overly aggressive and unsympathetic military. This contributed to negative feelings about the Vietnam conflict in general, and it helped fuel the anti-war efforts. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese made a particular effort to gain a propaganda victory by staging what became known as the Tet Offensive. Tet refers to a Vietnamese holiday, and the United States military assumed that there would be no battles on this day, that the Vietnamese would observe the holiday. But instead, the Viet Cong rebels in the South and their North Vietnamese military counterparts decided to stage over 100 attacks on United States military operations on the Tet holiday. This took the United States military by surprise. They ended up beating back all these attacks, and militarily, they actually won the Tet Offensive, the Americans did. But it didn't matter, because this was portrayed in the United States media as a loss for the Americans. It was portrayed that way because the initial surprise, and also the fact that these attacks took place throughout South Vietnam, even on the U.S. Embassy in the capital of South Vietnam. It seemed to demonstrate to people that the Viet Cong was everywhere, and that they could attack Americans wherever they were. This led to more American deaths, which were becoming intolerable in the eyes of the American people. So the fact that the offensive did not gain any military objectives kind of didn't matter. It gained its propaganda objective. Another sort of incident that happened in Vietnam was a thing that has happened in virtually every war. And that is that at some point, some soldiers get out of control and do things that they shouldn't in the heat of the moment. What happened, though, in many past wars is these things would be unknown to the public, hidden from public view. But in the living room war of Vietnam, eventually some of these things would come to light. An example of this was the My Lai massacre, which happened in 1969, which ended up being revealed to the American people by a journalist named Seymour Hersh. What happened was American troops came to a village which they believed had been harboring insurgents that were working against the Americans, and they ended up attacking this village. They didn't just kill almost all the 500 people that were there, but they first brutally assaulted them, raped most of the women and the young girls. They killed the children. It was an incredible, evil spectacle of carnage. Now, I'm not trying to excuse what they did, but as I said, these kind of things happen in almost every war. People get in a situation, and it's kind of like when an angry crowd gathers and they aren't really planning to be destructive, but then someone starts throwing rocks through a window, and pretty soon everybody's throwing rocks through windows. The same thing can happen with even more severe consequences when you have stressed out soldiers in a far-off land feeling with their lives threatened, and suddenly some attack gets out of control and everyone ends up joining in with it. Well, the bloodiness of the My Lai massacre was bad enough in and of itself. But what seemed to make people even more angry was that when the United States government found out about this, they tried to cover the whole thing up. They knew it would look bad for the war effort, so they didn't want anyone to know about it, which means none of the perpetrators of it were punished, because punishment would have required court-martials that would be public record, and people would find out that some horrible incident had taken place. So people were allowed to get away with the evil, and they tried to just hide it from the American people. So when it came out, it wasn't just the evil itself that bothered the American public. It was the fact that the government had tried to hide it from them. This led them to have even more distrust of the government. One of the most horrific images to come out of the Vietnam War was a group of people fleeing a napalm attack, which was photographed by a photographer named Nick Ut in 1973. Napalm was a chemical that was used to cause instant fires to burn vegetation. This was used in Vietnam because many of the attacks upon American troops came from fighters for the North Vietnamese Army or for the Viet Cong who were hiding in jungle areas and then would surprise the American troops. So one of the tactics to deal with this was to burn the vegetation where these fighters might be hiding. Well, here you have innocent civilians fleeing away from a napalm attack, including a young girl with no clothes. We don't know if they'd been burned off in the attack or if she had been frightened and ran out away from it when she happened to be nude, perhaps bathing or something like that. We're not really sure what happened, but we know that she is terrified, so terrified that she ran naked away from the attack. When the American public saw this photo, their hearts were pricked by it. They began to, even more so in a visceral, emotional manner, to realize how horrific the war in Vietnam was, not just for their soldiers who were dying there, but for the Vietnamese people. As the war became increasingly unpopular, President Lyndon Johnson realized that he would have a very difficult time being reelected in 1968. Now, this is despite winning one of the biggest presidential victories in American history in 1964. His prosecution of the war in Vietnam had been so disastrous, and he had become so unpopular, that he chose in 1968 not to run for re-election. This left it wide open as to who would become the nominee of the Democratic Party. It ended up being his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. But it was a closely contested contest that had its own brutalities that we'll talk about later. His main opponent was Richard Nixon, the former vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, the man who had lost to John F. Kennedy in 1960. But there was a third man in the race, George Wallace, a Southern Democrat, a conservative Southern Democrat who was very much in favor of racial segregation and who thought that the Democratic Party had already become too liberal in many ways. He ran as a third-party candidate for a newly formed party called the American Independent Party. Well, in this three-way split race, despite the country being overwhelmingly Democratic, as it had been since the time of the Great Depression, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, ended up winning because George Wallace and Hubert Humphrey essentially split the Democratic vote and helped Richard Nixon become president. Once Richard Nixon was president, the way he decided to deal with the war in Vietnam was through a process that he called Vietnamization. Now here in this picture, you have his Secretary of Defense, a man named Melvin Laird, who is explaining what the policy is. You see on this chart, he's talking about that from a high point of having over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, that those numbers would be reduced into where by 1972 there would be only 27,000 left. They argue that this could be possible if the United States focused on training South Vietnamese to fight the war for themselves. Richard Nixon would later refer to this process of Vietnamizing the war as peace with honor. This would allow the United States to withdraw from the war without looking like we had abandoned the South Vietnamese or that we were running away with our tail between our legs. Now, as Richard Nixon tried to turn the war over to Vietnam, he had a problem. And the problem was that North Vietnam continued to supply the communist rebels in South Vietnam. To get the supplies to the communist rebels in South Vietnam, they did not try to take them across the thin border between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which was heavily patrolled by American forces. Instead, they went a roundabout. They had trails that made their way through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia to reach South Vietnam. To prevent those supplies coming over those trails from North Vietnam to the rebels in the South, Richard Nixon secretly began the bombing of Laos and Cambodia. He had to do this secretly because he had no authorization from the United States Congress to engage in any sort of war with Cambodia and Laos. But he did it anyway. When this eventually became public, this gave the public another reason to distrust the government and be upset about the war in Vietnam. Here we were bombing other third-party countries that were not directly part of the war. This was intolerable and gave Richard Nixon a reason to press even harder to eventually end the war and peacefully withdraw the American troops. Now, in the meantime, protests continue to increase across the United States against the Vietnam War, including on college campuses like Kent State University. When demonstrations there got out of hand in 1970, National Guard troops and law enforcement officers were brought to campus to clear the protesters. They ended up, unfortunately, firing upon the protesters. And in that attack, 9 of the students were wounded, 4 of them were killed. Well, less than 2 weeks later, a similar incident took place on the campus of Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, this wasn't necessarily just a war protest. Instead, it was a civil rights protest. Activists had gathered on campus and were shutting down traffic on one of the main streets that passed through campus. Well, again, law enforcement officers and National Guard troops were brought in to clear out the protesters. The protesters withdrew to a nearby dormitory building. One of the National Guard troops at least claimed that he saw a sniper in the building. He fired. Other people started firing. And in the process, 12 people were wounded and 2 were killed. So we had in pretty quick succession, we had government, law enforcement personnel kill students on 2 campuses in the United States that were out there protesting against what they saw as the unfair policies of the government of the United States. Well, with this sort of unrest growing in the background, Richard Nixon made it a priority to peacefully end the war in Vietnam. This led to a series of peace talks taking place in Paris that the United States was eventually able to coerce South Vietnam to agree to. They did this by threatening to cut off aid. They prompted North Vietnam to agree by threatening to escalate the war. And this way they got the 2 sides to settle on a peace agreement, which should have left them as 2 separate countries. But it was not to be. What would eventually happen is the North Vietnamese would escalate the conflict with South Vietnam and eventually win the war. But in the meantime, the United States was withdrawing its troops. Even as the Vietnam War caused anxieties in the country, other things caused anxieties too, particularly the cultural conflict which had been brewing since the 1960s between the old traditional values of the 1950s and the new hippie sort of lifestyle and values of the 1960s. An example of this conflict can be seen in a popular television show from 1971 called All in the Family. All in the Family was created by the people in Hollywood to be a criticism of the old conservative culture of the 1950s. The hero of that older culture was a man named Archie Bunker, who was the father of this family in the TV show. Now, he and his wife had a daughter who married an extremely liberal gentleman and who had a black friend. So it involved sort of the hippie movement and liberalism and civil rights movement and things like that. And the old conservative, even racist Archie Bunker was supposed to be the person that the show made fun of. But in many people's eyes, he ended up being the hero of the show. He ended up being the most popular character because he was willing and able to express things that they felt like maybe they couldn't say. He was sort of standing up for an undercurrent in American society that felt like it was getting pushed aside in some ways by these cultural changes. So rather than being somebody who was mocked by the show, he ended up being a champion for an old way of thinking about things that was under attack. Another cultural development during the 1970s was the popularity of disco music. Disco music was an upbeat, positive kind of music. It was also a racially integrated kind of music. Rather than it being a type of music such as, say, country music, which was thought to be white music, or a type of music such as jazz, which was thought to be black music, it was something that involved people from both races. In that way, it was sort of a uniting thing of the times. Also, as I said, it was a positive sort of music during a troubled time. In those ways, many people latched onto it, but it also was criticized, made fun of. The fact that it didn't have as an enduring a legacy as you might think it would have had shows some of the cultural conflict that was taking place during this time. Even as this new form came along, some people disparaged it and didn't want anything to do with it. Another new form of music that came along in the 1970s that seemed to have more lasting power in the end was rap music. The first rap song to make it into the charts of what songs were most popular in the country was a song called Rapper's Delight, performed by a group called the Sugar Hill Gang in 1979. Now, some rap music had existed before this, but this was the first rap song to gain widespread popular appeal, which eventually led to much of the rap that is very popular in America today. The cultural angst of the 1970s could also be seen in the movies that were being made in Hollywood. A good example of this is the series of movies involving a character called Dirty Harry that starred the actor Clint Eastwood. Dirty Harry was a police officer who was tasked with fighting the difficult crime that existed in America at this time. He had to be just as brutal as the criminals themselves to overcome them. Well, that super tough guy who was willing to bend the rules to get the bad guys ended up being very popular. And it is telling us about the fear of crime that existed in this time period and the need people had for some strong figure to come and stand up against it. Another place where conflict brewed during this time period was in the process of integrating the public schools. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that public schools could not discriminate on the basis of race. Now, when this decision was originally made, Northerners looked down their nose at the Southerners who practiced segregation and thought, oh, those evil Southerners, good, the Supreme Court's going to force them to change now. But what happened was the courts didn't just order the integration of Southern schools. They also ordered the integration of schools in big northern cities that had large black populations. In some cases, they did this through a process called forced busing, such as in Boston in 1976. What they would do is they would send school buses into the black neighborhood to pick up certain selected students, to drive them across town to go to school in schools in white neighborhoods, and they would send buses through the white neighborhoods picking up some students to take them across town to go to school in schools in the black neighborhoods. Well, this sort of forced busing led to big protests among white residents of big cities. In 1976 in Boston, one of these protests led to a man grabbing an American flag and using the pole to assault a black protester. This image was captured by a photographer named Stanley Foreman, and he named the image the Soiling of Old Glory, referring to how this symbol of America was being used to assault somebody else. This became one of the iconic images of this time, demonstrating the division and strife that was felt in American cities as integration was forced upon them. Now, during this time period, blacks in these inner cities felt in many ways frustrated with their place in society, not just because of racial segregation, but also because of limited economic opportunities and what they felt were discriminatory practices being instituted against them by white police forces, etc. This led to a series of race riots in cities in 1965 and 1967. In the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, and then eventually in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. These expressions of frustration that led these protesters to turn into rioters that in some cases burned down entire neighborhoods ended up having a negative effect on the civil rights movement. As white people across the country had seen black protesters who were protesting peacefully attacked by white law enforcement officers, that had generated sympathy for them in other situations, such as the sit-ins or the marches that took place in the South. But when they saw people in black neighborhoods of big cities engaging in riots where they destroyed property and committed crimes, this had the opposite effect of reducing white sympathy for the problems that people in black neighborhoods were facing. Well, in response to these riots that took place in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson created a commission led by a man named Kerner, eventually known as the Kerner Commission, which produced a report about what they felt had led to the black uprisings in these riots in these cities. And they believed that what it was the hopelessness and poverty that was found in these urban settings. Essentially, they argued that environmental factors had led the black citizens to rise up and riot. But many people in American society didn't accept this explanation. Instead, they viewed it as simply the logical outcome of the liberal cultural permissiveness that was tolerated, by liberal culture. That they basically let people get away with too much. And this caused people in these cities to go out and lose control then, because they thought they could get away with too much, and they ended up going too far. Arguably the moment that society changed from the do anything you want idealism of the 1960s to kind of the depressed negativity of the 1970s was actually in the year 1968. In 1968, two of the important icons of the optimism of the 1960s were assassinated. One of them was Martin Luther King Jr., the man who famously had taught people to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and had given his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The other was Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of John Kennedy. Remember, John Kennedy had been assassinated while he was president of the United States. Well, his younger brother decided to take up the family cause of politics, and he ran for president himself. And he was viewed as the likely presidential nominee in 1968 if Lyndon Johnson wasn't going to be. But he was also assassinated. Now, he was much more liberal than his older brother, and liberals had latched onto him as their great hope to lead on in the battle of politics. But with these icons of progressive change in America gunned down, this left many of the would-be reformers negative and depressed about the future. If their greatest champions could just be killed, how could their cause ever succeed? Another event in 1968 that helped destroy the idealism of the 1960s was the Democratic Party National Convention. In 1968, the Democratic Party decided to choose its candidate for president at a convention held in Chicago. The mayor of Chicago was a Democrat named Richard Daley. And he could not tolerate all the protests that were going on in his city streets. The Democratic Party attracted the attention of liberal, progressive activists from throughout the country that viewed the Democratic Party as their potential champion in politics. But they needed to put pressure on that party to do what they wanted. So they held giant demonstrations and protests in the city. Well, Richard Daley sent in the police force and the National Guard to disperse these protesters. This ended up with riots in the streets, battles back and forth between the demonstrators and the law enforcement officers outside the convention hall where the Democratic Party was selecting its nominee for president. This made everybody involved, from the Democratic Party to the protesters in the streets to the cops trying to clear them out, look bad. This made the entire left side of the political spectrum in America, in some sense, to look bad. These deaths and clashes in 1968 contributed to the rise of Richard Nixon to become President of the United States. Now, we already discussed on a previous slide how he managed to win a three-way race for president. As George Wallace, the devout segregationist from the South, just stole enough Democratic votes from Hubert Humphrey that Richard Nixon was able to be elected president in one of the closest elections in American history. Richard Nixon, as a candidate for office, emphasized law and order. He focused on the excesses that had been born from the relaxed attitudes of the 1960s and how they had led to violence during this time period. But he had been elected with a minority of the vote. With the race split three ways, no one won 50% of the vote. Nonetheless, after he became president, he claimed that he was doing the will of what he described as a silent majority, a group of people in America that actually were superior in number to the other side, but were unwilling to speak out in public about their views for fear of being shamed and shouted down for them, or being accused of being racist or whatever it might be. So he claimed that he was representing this silent majority who had brought him into power. But he didn't want to get too bogged down in these conflicts within the country itself. So he seemed to focus his energy as president not on domestic policy, but on foreign policy. And in that regard, he practiced what became known as the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine was where he asserted America's supremacy, moral supremacy, in its embrace of democratic capitalism. He also denounced the contrary regimes around the world, such as communist countries. But he was unwilling to commit American forces into any more third world conflicts. So while he might talk that we believed in capitalism and talk that communism was wrong, he was not willing to engage Americans to fight for it anymore. This is part of what we had learned from the lesson of Vietnam, that our country would not tolerate a bunch of our young people and going out and dying for such a cause. So what this meant was that Richard Nixon had to come up with an alternative approach of how to engage in the Cold War. As suggested by his Secretary of State, a man named Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon then practiced a policy toward the Soviet Union that became known as détente. Détente is a French word that means an easing of hostilities. The way they accomplished this was through open cultural exchanges, through summits and treaty negotiations, through generally trying to work through their problems by talking through them, rather than threatening each other militarily. Well, this easing of tensions during this time period became a hallmark of it. In order to give real force to this idea of trying to improve relationships with the communist world, Richard Nixon made two important trips to communist countries in 1971 and 1972. He first visited communist China in 1971 Now, when I say communist China, I need to point out that during the civil war that took place in China after World War II, that the non-communist side of the Civil War ended up being forced off the mainland, and they ended up only having control of what is now known as Taiwan. So Taiwan never became part of communist China. Matter of fact, up until this point that Richard Nixon went and visited communist China, the United States recognized Taiwan as the actual ruler of all of China, even as communist China claimed its rule was entire, including over Taiwan, where they had no actual control. So in effect, we had two Chinas, one larger, one smaller, the large one communist, the smaller one capitalist, like the United States. So the United States had recognized the smaller one as what they claimed to be the legitimate government of China. Well, that eventually changed when we recognized the reality that most of the Chinese people actually lived in territory controlled by the communist government. So Richard Nixon went to visit China to normalize relationships with them. Now, having an entire history as a fierce anti-communist, he was one of the few people that could do this, that could reach out to China without appearing to be giving in to them. This was an important step in normalizing relationships between communist China and the United States. The next year, Richard Nixon visited the Soviet Union, the only president to do so since Franklin Roosevelt had done it when he and Stalin were leading the Allies during World War II. So like the visit to China, the visit to the Soviet Union was seen as a peace gesture, an opportunity for the two countries to begin to treat each other as equals and potential friends. In these ways, he changed the dynamics with these other communist countries. This then led to a couple of treaties being signed between the United States and the Soviet Union: the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, both negotiated and signed in 1972. What these treaties did was they slowed down the development of weapons by the two countries that could be used against each other. Now, they didn't halt the process. They didn't actually lower the number of weapons. They just reduced the rate at which they would increase. But this was seen as real progress in the two countries learning to live with each other. But even as our conflict with the Soviet Union was being reduced, a conflict in another area of the world was increasing. In 1973, several Arab nations, whose economies were primarily built upon the production of oil, formed an alliance called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These countries were angry at the United States for what they saw as it meddling in the Middle East, this area under Muslim control, particularly the United States' support of the country of Israel. So in 1973, they organized a boycott of the United States. They would no longer sell oil to the United States. This had a crushing effect upon the American economy because at that point, we were still dependent primarily upon foreign oil, particularly the best oil in the world, which came from the Middle East, from these OPEC countries. Well, this oil embargo had, as I said, a crushing effect on the American economy. People would wait in line for hours just to get a few gallons of gas. And if you don't have gas, then you can't move products to market, or if you're going to do them, it's going to be a lot more expensive. This had a ripple effect through the economy that was extremely negative, even though the embargo only lasted for about a year. Even as Richard Nixon was trying to escape the ghost of Vietnam, it rose up and caused problems for him. This came in the form of what were eventually known as the Pentagon Papers. This was a secret government study commissioned by the Department of Defense itself to honestly evaluate what had happened in Vietnam and why things had gone wrong. It was in effect a damning history of the American involvement in Vietnam. This was leaked to the papers, to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they began publishing it in full. There were attempts that were made to try to stop these newspapers from publishing this secret government report, which exposed the Vietnam War as being even worse than people had thought. Nonetheless, the United States Supreme Court ruled that this study could be published, and it was one more bad black eye on the reputation of the United States government. Concerned that future presidents might get us involved in bad situations like what happened in Vietnam, in 1973, the United States Congress passed something called the War Powers Resolution. What the War Powers Resolution did was essentially it gave presidents a time limit. They could send troops somewhere in the world if they thought it was an emergency, but they would be required to automatically bring those troops home after a certain number of days if Congress did not affirmatively authorize them to stay. This was a way for the United States Congress to try to avoid the problem of voting against any future war. All they had to do was decline to give authorization, and they thought the president wouldn't be able to send troops more than just for a few days before he'd have to bring them home. But what has happened in reality is most presidents have simply ignored the War Power Resolution, which is actually of questionable constitutional validity. Because we have separation of powers, the three branches of government. The United States Supreme Court, when this provision actually went to court, was unwilling to rule either for the presidency against the Congress or for the Congress against the presidency. And so it remained an open question whether this was a constitutional act. But the truth is, most presidents since it was passed have simply ignored it, saying that as commander-in-chief they can send the troops anywhere they want. Richard Nixon's most difficult part of his presidency, though, was not a product of the difficulties of Vietnam or any of the cultural conflicts that were going on. The problem was that he ran for re-election in 1972, and members of his campaign broke into his opponent's office to plant bugs so that they could listen to conversations and to steal whatever plans the Democrats might be coming up with to challenge Richard Nixon. Well, the people that entered into the Democratic National Headquarters to do these things ended up getting caught. And when they were caught, they refused to tell anybody, at least initially, who they were or why they were there. But they had been sent there by Richard Nixon's campaign, but without his knowledge, at least as far as we can tell. We eventually found out this truth, that they were sent by Nixon's campaign, despite him trying to cover it up. You see, when he found out that his own campaign had broken into his opponent's headquarters, rather than taking the high road and going on TV and announcing to the American people, it was my own campaign that did it, I fired everyone associated with it, instead he tried to cover it up. He ordered government officials to not investigate it. He ordered government officials to lie about it. And this was eventually exposed by a couple of determined reporters at the Washington Post named Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who tracked down the truth of what happened. By tracking down the truth, which eventually led to the impeachment and resignation of Richard Nixon, which we'll talk about in just a moment, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein became heroes to the journalistic community. And in the decades that followed, reporters would all try to be like them. They would look for bad things happening in government that they could expose too. Well, after they exposed that Richard Nixon had tried to cover up the water break-in and its connection to his campaign, which, by the way, that all took place before the election in 1972, but nobody knew that it was really connected to Nixon until after the election, so he actually won a big victory in 1972. Well, what happened was, when it all came out, the House Judiciary Committee, which investigates such things, voted to impeach Richard Nixon. Now, this did not mean he was impeached. There would have to be a vote of the entire House of Representatives to do that. But he saw that was going to happen, that he was going to get impeached by the House of Representatives. At that time, only the second president in history that would have been. And so before that could happen, he decided to quit. Richard Nixon in 1974 became the first president in American history to resign from office. He was replaced by his vice president, a man named Gerald Ford, who had previously been a congressman from Michigan. When Gerald Ford became president, one of the important first things he did was he issued Richard Nixon a full pardon. That way he felt this, what he described as a national nightmare of the Watergate scandal, which, by the way, it was called the Watergate scandal because it was named after an office building by the shores of the Potomac River called the Watergate Building, where the Democratic Party had its headquarters. Okay, people oftentimes wonder about where the name comes from. But anyway, Richard Nixon wanted to put that scandal behind us as a country, and he thought the best way to do that is to not have any sort of criminal prosecution of Richard Nixon that could string out the whole thing. Instead, he hoped, and that this is what happened, that after Richard Nixon was essentially legally forgiven for whatever he had done wrong, that he would just kind of disappear from public notice, and he did. Well, this time period of unraveling wasn't just all about politics. It was also about economics. This was a period of deindustrialization that ended up profoundly affecting the makeup of America. Now, when I say deindustrialization, what I'm talking about is industry moving around or ceasing to exist and having a profound effect upon the communities where it had previously been. Part of this process was the declining importance of labor in many manufacturing processes. In some cases, machines were designed that could do things quicker and more easily than what humans could do. But you could go even a step farther. If you became totally automated with what is called automation, then you could even remove the human operator from being in charge of the machine that is doing the thing faster and better than them. Well, if you can build a factory full of robots in this way, you don't need laborers anymore. And this led to a decline of these sorts of jobs in the country, in these factories. And these were primarily union jobs, which made labor unions less important too. Even as the factories themselves were changing, the location of the factories was changing too. Some states are more friendly to businesses than others. In some cases, this may be that they charge lower taxes on those businesses than other states. It also may be that they have what are called right-to-work laws. These are laws that make it illegal in that state for a business to be organized where it will only hire union workers. So this reduces the importance of unions. These sorts of attitudes then lead to what we call a business-friendly environment in a particular state, where they're a lot more likely to not have unions trying to negotiate for higher wages, and where they're less likely to be trying to take money from the businesses through taxes. Well, the attitudes of these different parts of the country led to a mass exodus of businesses from what became known as the Rust Belt, stretching all the way from Wisconsin to New York State, highlighted on this map here. This is where economies had primarily depended upon a system of factories that employed many factory workers. But when, under these business pressures of this time period, many of those companies either quit or relocated, their factories were left behind to rust, and this area then became known as the Rust Belt, an area of America that was losing population and was economically depressed because of these changes to how the economy and manufacturing plants functioned. Well, in contrast to those Rust Belt cities of the Northwest that were, when I say Northwest, I mean the old Northwest, what is now called the Midwest of America. As those businesses left the Midwest, left the Rust Belt, many of them moved to the southern United States, what became known as the Sun Belt. Now, there was a reason why the Sun Belt had not been wildly populated in the past. It's because the summer temperatures can be oppressive. Well, once we had air conditioning, that was no longer a problem, and people then happily moved to the south to enjoy the air conditioning during the summer and the pleasant, moderate temperatures in the winter. This led to the economic growth of the South, as it not only provided better weather, but it provided more friendly business environments to companies that might want to relocate. A champion of this new sort of society that was growing up in the South was Ronald Reagan, and we'll talk a lot more about him as this course continues. That's his picture on the left. He became an important figure in the development of the New Right. Now, we've mentioned the New Right before. Let me remind you that it's part of the conservative movement. It's just a new branch of conservative that's particularly focused on free enterprise and having small government and fighting communism and things like that. There ended up groups rising up to support the aims of the New Right, such as the John Birch Society, a very conservative group that saw America fighting against the evils of communism and felt they needed to mobilize people against it to support candidates like Ronald Reagan. So this is coming to being the same time period as these other pressures are taking place on American society, that there's an alternative growing on the right to what they viewed as the excesses of the left during the 1960s and some of the 1970s. During this time period, the politics of sex is also changing too. And what I mean by that is how people practice sex and what they associated with sex was changing. And this had a change on the greater society too. An example of this can be seen in how couples who would have gotten married at one time came to live with each other instead. And then once they were together, they might actually split up more often than people had in the past. So look at these two charts here. The one on the left, shown with the red line, shows the number of divorces per 1,000 married women in society at any given time. So if we go back to the 1960s, there might be only around 5% of the women at any given time who were divorced. But by 1980, that figure was up near 25%. And over the lifetime of couples, there is over a 50% chance that they would get divorced. Well, one of the reasons that things were changing to allow couples to end up choosing divorce was because people were going into marriages with different expectations. In some cases, the expectation of not getting married at all or for a long time. This led to a rise in what we call cohabitation rates. This is where couples live together as though they're like husband and wife before they actually are. Sort of a trial run on marriage before you get to it. Well, this grew dramatically during this time period too. From back in the 1960s, less than 3% of couples cohabitating before marriage. By the time you get to today, about 70% of couples do. Well, the period of transition for these two things was during the 1960s and the 1970s, as suddenly couples were a lot more willing to cohabitate rather than get married, and then get divorced after they had been married. One of the reasons that it became so possible to have so many divorces was because of a change in divorce law. California in 1969 created what became known as no-fault divorces. Prior to this, to get a divorce, a couple would have to give a judge just cause. They would have to give the judge some big reason why they shouldn't be married anymore, such as one of the spouses had cheated, had committed adultery, and was unwilling to change and save the marriage. But in California in 1969, they said, no, you don't need any specific grounds of wrongdoing to get divorced anymore. Just one of the people in the marriage has to claim that the couple now has irreconcilable differences. That was the term that was actually used. In other words, there's things that we disagree on that we're just never going to agree about, and this makes it impossible for us to stay married. Well, such a liberal divorce law ended up becoming the standard that spread around the country. Suddenly it was much easier to get divorced. Abortion also became an issue during this time period. Abortions had existed for a long time, but generally in American society throughout its history, they had been limited or outlawed. But then in 1973, in the United States Supreme Court decision in the case of Roe v. Wade, the United States Supreme Court claimed that there was a right to privacy that was embedded in the Constitution somewhere, that they thought was sufficiently broad for a woman to find refuge within it and find the right to terminate her pregnancy if she saw fit. This ruling by the Supreme Court struck down laws in all 50 states and made abortions available to women all over the country. Another area where sexual morals was changing was in the area of pornography. In 1973, a man in California received a pornographic catalog that he had not ordered. He was so offended by it that he brought legal charges against the company that had sent it to him. Well, whether or not the state of California could punish this company came down in the courts to a question of obscenity. There was this idea that pornography was essentially an act of freedom of speech. But the courts had ruled that not all speech could be allowed. In fact, if a thing was obscene, the government could restrict it and even prohibit it. So the question became, is pornography obscene? Well, in this case, the Supreme Court, among other things, argued that something that appeals purely to people's sexual appetites could be ruled obscene unless it had serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, such as a textbook or a movie or a play that's depicting some sort of sexual thing that happened in the past. Well, these exceptions ended up being loopholes that the pornography industry could take advantage of. And so rather than this providing a consistent way to limit the spread of pornography, it actually led to an explosion of pornography. Another incident in this area of changing sexuality concerned homosexuality. In 1969, in New York State, police officers raided a bar at a place called the Stonewall Inn. This was a gathering place in New York City for people in the gay community. Now, at this time, homosexuality could still be outlawed, and cops routinely would go to gay establishments and harass the patrons there, just to let them know that they weren't supposed to be legally engaging in that sort of conduct. Well, when they raided the Stonewall Inn in 1969, the patrons ended up fighting back, and you had a multi-day street brawl about this. This energized the gay rights community in the United States and was one of the defining moments of it. At the same time, even as the gay rights movement is getting a start, the women's rights movement is experiencing a setback. An amendment had been proposed to the Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment, which would require men and women to be treated exactly the same under the law. But activists like Phyllis Schlafly argued that this was a bad thing, that women had a unique and different role in society and different physical needs, for example, and that trying to treat men and women exactly the same would be counterproductive. So she led a campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment and actually was successful in defeating it, not allowing it to be ratified by the states before its time expired in 1982. In addition to the war in Vietnam and various cultural issues where America was struggling and disagreeing with itself, another area of struggle was the economy. The economy during this time period was characterized by something that a politician, Jimmy Carter, called the misery index. Jimmy Carter was a politician from Georgia who defeated Gerald Ford, who tried to run for president after replacing Richard Nixon when Nixon resigned. Carter won the election, but he didn't win so much because he was an ideologue. He wasn't offering some sort of liberal alternative to the conservative Gerald Ford. Matter of fact, on most policy positions, they were fairly like each other. Instead, what Jimmy Carter offered was a clean morality, in contrast to the dirty sort of politics that Washington, D.C. had become associated with, particularly through the presidency of Richard Nixon. Well, as Carter was running for president and eventually defeating Gerald Ford in 1976, he accused the Nixon administration of essentially destroying the economy. He pointed out that America had fallen into a time period of what some economists called stagflation, where the country paradoxically had high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Usually you only have one or the other, because inflation eventually leads to unemployment, which then gets rid of the inflation, and then unemployment eventually leads to a raising of prices, which then creates the inflation. And they cycle back and forth between each other rather than existing at the same time. But during the mid-1970s, they did exist at the same time, which is a really bad thing for an economy. So Jimmy Carter called this combination of unemployment and inflation the misery index. He said that they could be added together to produce a total number. So let's say you had 10% unemployment and a 10% inflation rate, then you would end up with a misery index of 20. Well, this graph shows what the misery index, the addition of unemployment to inflation, reached over various years. You can see during the red stripe of the Nixon years that the misery index got pretty darn high, up near 20%. Well, it started to come down, though, after Nixon was out of office during the Ford years. You might look at that and think that Gerald Ford was making progress and he deserved to be reelected. But instead, Jimmy Carter blamed the Republicans for the misery index having been so high under Richard Nixon. And this persuasion helped him get elected president. But as you can see from the graph, things actually turned around and got much worse during his presidency. This would be one of the very difficult negatives of the Carter presidency that would eventually contribute to him not being reelected. But as president, he did have a great success. That success was in foreign policy, when he negotiated a peace deal between the Muslim country of Egypt and the Jewish country of Israel in 1979. He had the leader of the two countries come to the presidential retreat in Maryland known as Camp David. There he negotiated a peace treaty between them. This was the first Muslim country to even recognize the state of Israel as a legitimate country. This was an important step toward possible peace in the Middle East. But even though Jimmy Carter had success in that one particular venture in the Middle East, he ended up having his presidency defined by a failure there. In 1979, there was a revolution in the country of Iran. Iran was being run by a dictator, a man friendly toward the United States, who had received Jimmy Carter for an official visit at one point during the Carter presidency. He ran Iran as a country friendly to the United States, so the United States could get oil from Iran. But the people in that country didn't like being ruled by a dictator like this. And this then led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where they deposed the dictator and created what they called an Islamic Republic in its place. Feeling that the United States had propped up the bad guy that had been ruling over them, the rebels during the revolution invaded the United States embassy and took 52 Americans hostage. Well, Carter was never able to get them home. They were not released until Ronald Reagan took office in 1980. Along the way, this inability of Carter to get these hostages out of Iran ended up greatly decreasing his popularity among the American people. He even sent in a rescue mission where the helicopters involved in it crashed into each other and killed everyone on the rescue mission. making the United States, under the leadership of Jimmy Carter, to appear even more incompetent. The last difficulty that Carter faced in his foreign policy was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union wanted a piece both of the oil riches of the Middle East and access to the warm tropical oceans of the Indian Ocean. But the Soviet Union had no such southern border. So they decided that they would eventually work themselves there by attacking a neighboring country that would get them closer. This was the country of Afghanistan. Eventually, the Soviet Union would become totally bogged down in Afghanistan. But this wasn't apparent immediately in 1980. So in this year, Jimmy Carter announced what became known as the Carter Doctrine, that the United States would defend its interests in the Middle East, even against military power from some other country. This appeared to be some sort of threat against the Soviet Union, but not really, because Carter was never really willing to follow through on it. The closest he came was ordering the United States to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. Well, this didn't cause the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan. If anything, it simply harmed United States athletes who could never go earn a medal in 1980. And that concludes the materials in this chapter 28 about the unraveling of the United States of America.